Scott Alexander, and in this video I'm continuing my analysis of Maimonides' 26 Propositions of Aristotelian philosophy located in his introduction to Volume 2 of his Guide of the Perplexed. In this video I'll be talking about the first three of those propositions, which I call the infinity propositions. I'll briefly introduce the whole concept of infinity and then go through each of the three propositions. I'll explain how Maimonides will use these propositions in his grand proof for the existence of God in the next chapter of the guide. I'll then explain why he thinks each proposition is true and how we should resolve any problems with it. The general importance of the concept of infinity for Maimonides was that if the universe were infinite in size and had existed from eternity, then it could not have been created by God. That is, it wasn't created at all. Everything created is finite. More to Maimonides' point, which focuses on causal chains in our world, if those causal chains really were infinite, God would not be their first cause, because if they were infinite, they would have no initial cause. In other words, if the causal chains were infinite, there could be no creator by definition. God would not be the creator of the universe or its prime unmoved mover at the inception of all causal chains. Therefore, before we get going, it's important to focus on precisely what we mean when we talk about the infinite. We'll see that whatever modern notions we have about infinity were vastly different from the way the ancients thought about it. We will also see that they were not necessarily wrong in their thinking. Aristotle taught that the infinite is unknowable. Things composed of infinites are also unknowable. We can only know things that are finite. Aristotle wrote, "The point is that knowledge of a compound is taken to depend on knowing what things and how many things it is composed of. Those things must be finite for us to understand them." Reflecting on the deeper meaning of this, Maimonides' great modern commentator, Rabbi Dr. Yehuda Even-Shmuel, wrote, "Aristotle taught that the infinite is not subject to understanding, for if our world were infinite, we could never know anything about it. If there is a science of the world as a whole, it must acknowledge the finitude of the world." Maimonides was right to commence his presentation of the Aristotelian system with the problem presented by the hypothesis of infinity. The question we're asking is, are we really committed to learning about our world? Because that commitment requires that we assume that it's something we can learn about. Otherwise, if we assume that it's infinite, our science cannot be optimistic. Our inquiry must assume that the world is finite. While we now hardly think that there is a problem with the notion of infinity, ancient thinkers tended to reject the idea. The notion of infinity and boundlessness represented a terrifying descent into chaos. Let's turn to the propositions. My versions of these propositions draw on multiple sources to make them readable and accessible. Here are the infinity propositions. Proposition 1, the existence of an infinite magnitude is impossible. Proposition 1 means that there really is no actual infinite thing in existence in our world. Proposition 2 says that the coexistence of an infinite number of actual physical magnitudes is impossible. What this means is that there is no group or set of actual physical things which are infinite in size or number. Proposition 3 is one of the longer propositions. Boiled down, it generally says that an infinite number of incorporeal things existing together is impossible. I'll go through the actual language of Proposition 3 shortly and explain what this proposition is trying to get at with this talk of incorporeal things. Now, the key idea in these three propositions is that causal chains cannot be infinite. The reason that causal chains cannot be infinite is that they must come to an end. They always end with the last thing caused, which is the final result that we see. But if there's a last step in the causal chain, there must be a first. Take the example of a row of dominoes. Every row of dominoes concludes with when the final domino topples over and commences with the first domino that falls. The row of dominoes cannot go on forever in either direction, either from its beginning or from its end. How will Maimonides use the infinity propositions? In the next chapter, he uses the infinity propositions to show that since the celestial bodies are in some sense physical, and all physical bodies are finite, it follows that the heavens could not be infinite. And on the assumption that all finite motion on the earth ultimately originates with the seemingly endless rotation of the heavens, and since there could only be a finite number of celestial bodies in the causal chain leading to earthly motion, no such causal series could go on ad infinitum, but must have an end. It follows that since each causal chain must be finite, every such chain must commence with a first mover, ultimately responsible for all of those motions. This mover, Maimonides later explains, must be God. Let's talk about the meaning of the word infinite. If there is an infinite, it must be something which is capable of being finite. In other words, whenever we talk about an infinite, we're talking about an extension or magnitude which could, in principle, be measured, but which is, nonetheless, infinite. The key is that we're talking only about measurable things, and whether a measurable thing could actually be unlimited. By this definition, we eliminate certain common uses, like if I were to say, my love for you is infinite, but my patience is not. Love and patience are not measurable magnitudes because no emotion can be quantified. Statements like this use the term infinite in a purely metaphorical sense, not in the way we mean it. One consequence of this definition is that minds or souls, which cannot be measured, could not properly be called infinite. Here are some rules about any allegedly infinite thing. Each one of these rules is a reason why an actual infinite is impossible. An infinite thing is impossible because, like anything else in our world, it must have form. It must have a specific figure. Everything has a form. That form is nothing other than the limitation of its matter. No infinite thing could be subject to form just because of this limitation. But an infinite would, by definition, be unlimited. There are no unlimited physical forms. It follows that there's no unlimited, infinite physical thing. There is no infinite thing. Another rule is that an infinite must be in place. Every physical thing must, in the Aristotelian system, occupy a place. The place is defined as the surrounding equal and separate limit of the surrounded body. The place of a thing is equal to the body surrounded, but separate from it. An infinite could have no such limited place. A corollary of this is that an actual infinite body could never move in any direction. That's because it would always rest in its infinite place, if it could conceivably have such a place. But the infinite, just because it is infinite, would take up all places and could not move. But this would be absurd, since we see that everything in our world moves. We live in a universe of motion. Another rule is that, as we've seen, an infinite is unmeasurable. An infinite is, by definition, unlimited. It could never be measured. There would never be a limit to its measurement. It couldn't be measured because an infinite cannot be traversed. This means that you could never reach the outer bound of your measurement, that is, you could never traverse to it. Therefore, we must reject the existence of an actual infinite, including anything eternal, except for God. Maimonides wrote that our proper belief is that there is nothing eternal in any way at all existing simultaneously with God. She'ein shum davar kadmon klal im Hashem. Maimonides' first proposition was about the impossibility of the existence of a single infinite body. The next two will be about the impossibility of an infinite number of actual, that is to say, not potential, beings in simultaneous existence. They must be a number, they must be actual, and they must simultaneously coexist. Proposition 2 is about multiple corporeal beings, while Proposition 3 is about multiple incorporeal beings. The outcome is that there can be no set of infinite things, either physical or incorporeal. Maimonides used Proposition 2 in the next chapter to show that only a finite number of celestial bodies could exist in the causal chain leading to motion on Earth. Now, why does Maimonides think that this proposition is true? There are three reasons why an infinite number of finite physical things is impossible. The first reason is that numerables, that is to say, things that are countable, are always finite in number, in that they compose a numerable set. In other words, if you were to say that there were an actual infinite number of things, like, say, for instance, you claimed that there were X number of widgets where X equaled infinity, it would be as though you had said, I have completely counted that which is infinite and have come to the end of it despite its being infinite. In other words, I counted all the widgets and I know it's an infinite number. Such a statement is absurd. You could never finish counting an actual infinite number of widgets. That's because an infinite is that of which, however much you take, there will always be more. A second reason is that any set of numbers must be divisible into odd and even. But a set of infinite numbers could never be divided into odd and even. As soon as you made the division, you would have a limitation on the set. A third reason is that a numerable infinite series in actual existence would have no end. But anything that has a beginning must have an end, like with the row of dominoes. So there is no actual array or multitude of infinite things, and surely no infinite causal chain. Is there a problem with Proposition 2? Yes. There exist two important types of exceptions to the rule against an infinite number of things. They're called the accidental and the potential infinites. Recall that Proposition 2 had said that the coexistence of an infinite number of actual infinite magnitudes was impossible. There are three key terms. The group of things that are allegedly impossible must simultaneously coexist. They must be a number, that is to say that they're numerable, and they are actual, in actual existence as opposed to potential existence. Thus, the language of Proposition 2 shows that there could be certain types of infinites by exclusion, those that are not in actual existence, not numerable by us, and not simultaneously coexisting. We could add that they also must not be causally related. Such things could conceivably be infinite. Maimonides had two types of possible infinites in mind. The first one was the accidental infinite, and the second the potential infinite. With the potential infinite, you could, according to geometry, keep dividing a line into multiple parts forever. The only thing that's stopping you from doing this is that you would die first. That's why it's only a potentially infinite division. You could never live to complete it. An excellent example of this is the asymptotic curve, which I've placed a rendering of on the screen. No matter how long you extend that curve or how far you extend that curve and divide the space between the curve and its baseline, you'll never achieve identity between the curve and its base. In other words, while you can see this graph of the curve, you cannot see its infinite extension, but you know it could be there. It is a potential infinite. It's a logical conclusion drawn from the infinite divisibility of any line. It cannot be portrayed by an image in the imagination, because the imagination only portrays finite physical things. Maimonides could see, however, he could see logically that there could exist potential and accidental infinites, even though they could not be pictured by an image in the imagination. Turning now to the second exception, the accidental infinite. The accidental infinite was about successions of accidents in matter. These successive accidents could conceivably go on forever. The accidental infinite could refer to the succession of forms in matter, the succession of moments in time, the successions of accidents occurring to a substance like change of hair color, the succession of human or animal generations, and the successive rotations of the heavens. The reason that these types of non-simultaneous infinite multitudes could be conceived was that the potential and accidental infinites are non-causal divisions and successions. One rotation of the moon is not the cause of the succeeding rotation. The impossible causal chain that Proposition 2 is talking about would have to be like a row of dominoes, where all the dominoes are real and exist at the same time. Such an infinite multitude could not exist. But an infinite succession perhaps could exist. And that's really what we see. We do see what is potentially an infinite, the seemingly endless rotation of the stars. We do see that the celestial orbs keep spinning. Similarly, there's no obvious reason why the generations of a successful species could not continue. Now, as promised, I'll return to Proposition 3. Proposition 3 reads, "The existence of an infinite number of causes and effects is impossible, even if they were not corporeal magnitudes. If, for example, one intelligence were the cause of a second the cause of a third the cause of a fourth, etc., the series could not be continued ad infinitum." Now let's unpack this. Proposition 3 is about an array of incorporeal beings, even though Maimonides has phrased it in terms of an infinite number of causes and effects. He quickly clarifies that these are not the normal numerable things that we spoke of in the last two propositions. Instead, the example he gives is about a causal chain involving a set or array of higher intelligences. Now remember, we already said that minds and souls were not, strictly speaking, numerable. The idea that he's referring to here comes from the history of Neoplatonic philosophy, with its view of the way the Platonic ideal of the good manifests itself through creation. I'm placing on the screen some schematic representations of this idea, but I'll try and explain it now. The basic notion was the good cannot help but shed its goodness upon all things, the way the sun sheds its light on all creation, the way a fountain necessarily pours forth its life-giving waters. Oversimplified and stated schematically, it works like this. The first emanated idea reflects upon itself and upon its creator, which is God. In that very act of reflection, it creates another idea, together with a celestial sphere as its material objectification and reflection. The idea reflects on itself and spins off another idea and sphere. The second idea goes through a similar process of reflection to create a third idea and sphere, ultimately creating an array of 10 minds and 10 spheres. The reason it stops at 10 is, number one, because the universe is finite, because of our observational experience of the existence of 10 planetary bodies, and because an infinite causal chain is untraversable. Now, this story that I've just told you comes from Avicenna. It's sometimes called emanationism. Avicenna was the Latinized name of the philosopher Ibn Sina, who lived from 980 to 1037. His story represents a working out of ideas going back to Plotinus and perhaps to Plato and Pythagoras. Although Maimonides was familiar with Avicenna's emanatory system and sometimes refers to this as emanation, Shefa, he never entirely commits to it. In any event, Proposition 3 clearly rejects any such infinite array of such ideas, minds, souls, angels, or any other incorporeal entities. It would, however, allow a limited causal chain of 10 or some other real number of them. In my essay, I discuss other ways that Maimonides would expand the number of incorporeal beings. Now, that's all I wanted to say about infinity in this video. In the next video, I'll discuss the motion propositions, propositions 4 through 9. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. Thank you very much for listening. You may contact me at scottmalexander@rcn.com with comments, questions, or criticisms. Click on the description panel of this talk on YouTube to see links to any documents mentioned in this video. Please visit my website, maimonides-guide.com, to see my commentary essays on each chapter of Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, currently completed through the entire first volume of the guide, and now including my commentary on the introduction to the second volume. On that website, you'll also find associated essays I've written, podcasts, videos, and important links. And of course, please like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe, and hit the YouTube notification bell.